My father asked me to save the family on a Tuesday afternoon, his voice low and deliberate, the way people speak when they already know the answer might cost them everything. He did not ask how I was doing. He did not mention the weather or my work or anything ordinary. He went straight to the point, as if we were continuing a conversation that had started long before I picked up the phone. "I need your help," he said. "This is about all of us." Those words should have felt warm. They did not. They landed like a warning I could not yet translate. I stood in my kitchen with the phone pressed to my ear, staring at the faint scratch on the wall above the sink, listening as he talked about responsibility and loyalty. He spoke about pressure, about how families had to pull together when things got complicated. When he said my stepmother was overwhelmed and my younger sister was scared, I stayed quiet. When he told me this was the moment to step up, I stayed quiet. And when he finally said, "Your mother would have wanted you to do the right thing," my silence became intentional. What he did not know was that my mother had planned for moments like this long before she died. She had prepared for the possibility that love could turn into leverage. And if I had spoken that afternoon even for a moment, I would have given them exactly what they were looking for. So I listened. I agreed to nothing. I explained nothing. I said less than they expected. That silence would end up saving me. After the call ended, the kitchen felt too quiet. The hum of the refrigerator sounded louder than usual, and I realized my shoulders were tight, drawn up near my ears. I exhaled slowly and leaned against the counter, trying to steady the feeling that something had shifted. My father had never spoken to me like that before. Not directly. Not with that careful urgency. I was in my early 30s then, living on my own, working full-time, paying my bills without anyone's help. I had built a life that did not require permission or approval, and my father knew that. Or at least he used to. That was why his words unsettled me. He had not asked if I could help. He had assumed I would. As I replayed the conversation in my head, I noticed what he had not said. He had not mentioned specifics. No numbers, no clear problem. Just a vague sense of crisis wrapped in family language. It felt rehearsed, as if he had practiced the tone but avoided the details on purpose. That avoidance mattered. My father and I had not always been distant. When my mother was alive, we were a unit. She had been the steady center of our household, practical and calm, never dramatic. After she died, everything rearranged itself too quickly. My father filled the silence with motion, and within a year there was another woman in the house, another rhythm, another set of expectations. At the time, I told myself that change was normal, that adults found their way through loss however they could. I did not question the way decisions began to happen without my input, or how conversations became shorter and more transactional. I was already an adult after all. I told myself I did not need to be included. Standing in my kitchen that afternoon, I felt the echo of those choices. The quiet I had practiced for years was suddenly being tested. Later that evening, my father sent a text asking if I could come by later in the week. He said it would be good for all of us to talk in person. He added that my stepmother wanted to be there too. The word "us" sat on the screen like a weight. It did not include me. It included a plan. I agreed to meet them because refusing would have raised questions too early. I did not explain my hesitation. I did not mention my schedule or ask what the meeting was about. I kept my answers short and neutral, the way I had learned to do when conversations felt guided rather than genuine. That night, as I got ready for bed, I caught my reflection in the bathroom mirror and paused. I looked tired, but not afraid. There was a difference. Fear asks you to run. What I felt asked me to pay attention. My mother used to say that when people start speaking in generalities, it is because specifics do not favor them. I had not thought about that line in years, but it came back to me as I turned off the light. I lay awake longer than usual, listening to the quiet of my apartment, thinking about how often family loyalty was used to smooth over inconvenient truths. By the time I fell asleep, I knew one thing for certain. Whatever my father was asking me to do, it was not simple. And it was not about me. In the days that followed, his tone changed again. He called once more, this time softer, almost apologetic. He told me not to worry. He said there was no rush, that he just wanted us all on the same page. He asked if work had been stressful lately, if I was feeling overwhelmed. The concern sounded gentle, but it carried an edge I could not ignore. I answered the way I always did when I sensed a trap forming. I kept things vague. I said work was fine. Life was busy. Nothing unusual. I could almost hear him filing those answers away, measuring them against something I could not see. When the call ended, I realized I was no longer reacting out of habit. I was choosing restraint. Silence was no longer something I slipped into automatically. It was something I was holding deliberately. On the morning of the meeting, I dressed carefully, not to impress, but to feel grounded. As I locked my door behind me, I felt a strange calm settle in. Whatever they were preparing to ask, I would not rush to meet it. I would listen. I would observe. And I would remember that my mother had trusted me enough to leave me prepared, even if I did not yet understand how much that preparation would matter. I did not know then how far my father was willing to go, or how quickly concern could turn into control. But as I drove toward the house I grew up in, one thought stayed with me, steady and clear. If they wanted answers, they would have to earn them. Family had not always been a word that made my chest tighten. There was a time when it meant predictability, shared routines, and the quiet understanding that someone would notice if you were missing from the table. Before everything changed, my mother was the axis our household turned on. She was not overly sentimental or loud about love. She showed it in practical ways, in calendars kept neatly on the fridge and bills paid on time, in questions that were asked without prying. She believed that stability was a form of care, and she treated it seriously. She also believed in preparation, not in a fearful way, but in a grounded one. She used to say that love did not cancel out reality, and that trusting someone did not mean handing them every detail of your life. At the time, those words sounded cautious, even pessimistic. I did not understand how much foresight they carried. When she got sick, she handled it the same way she handled everything else. Quietly, thoroughly. She made lists. She organized files. She insisted on conversations that my father tried to avoid. He did not like talking about what might happen next. He preferred hope to planning. My mother respected hope, but she trusted preparation more. After she died, the house felt hollow in a way I could not explain to people who had not lived there. It was not just grief. It was disorientation. My father moved through rooms as if he was waiting for instructions that no longer came. He stopped cooking real meals. He let mail pile up. Decisions were postponed, then quietly outsourced. I was already an adult by then, living on my own, but I came by often. At first, it was to help. Then it was to check in. And slowly, without anyone announcing it, my presence became optional rather than expected. My father met my stepmother less than a year after the funeral. He framed it as companionship, not replacement, and I wanted to believe him. She was efficient, organized, and composed. She spoke confidently about systems and routines, about how households needed structure. She never raised her voice. She never asked permission either. At first, her involvement felt helpful. She reminded my father of appointments. She reorganized the kitchen. She suggested changes that made sense on the surface. I told myself I was being too sensitive when I noticed she often spoke for him, answering questions before he could. I told myself adjustment took time. Then my half-sister was born, and the center of gravity shifted completely. My father came alive again in a way that was both reassuring and painful to watch. He poured his energy into being present, into being needed. I understood that instinct. What I did not expect was how easily I would fade into the background. It did not happen all at once. It happened in moments that were small enough to dismiss. A holiday dinner scheduled without checking my availability. A family decision announced after it was already made. Conversations that started with, "We've talked about this," when I had not been part of the discussion. I remember one Thanksgiving in particular. I arrived with a dish I had spent the morning preparing only to find the menu had changed. My stepmother smiled and told me not to worry, that it was easier this way. My father avoided my eyes. I sat at the table feeling like a guest in a place that used to be mine. I told myself I was overreacting. I told myself I was independent, that I did not need inclusion to feel secure. But something inside me began to settle into a quieter shape. I stopped offering opinions. I stopped volunteering information. Not because I wanted distance, but because distance was already there. Over time, language changed too. My stepmother spoke often about balance and fairness, usually in reference to my half-sister's needs. My independence was framed as advantage, something that allowed me to give more, expect less. When I disagreed, it was done gently, almost kindly, as if my resistance was a misunderstanding rather than a boundary. My father went along with it, not enthusiastically but passively. He nodded. He deferred. When I asked him directly what he thought, he said he just wanted everyone to get along. It was the first time I realized peace was more important to him than clarity. I did not become silent overnight. It happened gradually, like a muscle tightening after repeated strain. Each time I spoke up and felt the conversation shift away from me, I learned a little more about what was expected. I learned that being agreeable was easier than being heard. The first time I truly felt replaced was not during an argument or a dramatic moment. It was during a quiet afternoon when I stopped by unannounced. My father was busy. My stepmother preoccupied, my half-sister asleep. No one asked me to stay. No one offered coffee. I left after a few minutes, realizing that my presence no longer changed the shape of the day. I carried that realization with me long after I drove away. It was not anger I felt, but something colder. A recognition that the family I belonged to now operated on a different set of assumptions, ones that did not include my perspective unless it was convenient. By the time my father called me years later and asked me to save the family, the pattern was already familiar. His words did not come out of nowhere. They followed a long history of decisions made without me, of concern expressed only when compliance was required. That was when my mother's voice came back to me clearer than it had in years. She had once told me that families, like systems, reveal their priorities under pressure. I had not known what she meant then. Standing in my kitchen after that call, I understood it perfectly. Whatever was coming was not sudden. It was simply the moment when everything that had been quietly rearranged finally demanded acknowledgement. And for the first time, I stopped trying to fit myself back into a shape that no longer existed. I did not grow up secretive. I grew up observant, and over time, that observance hardened into restraint. Silence came to me gradually, not as a tactic, but as a response. In the early years after my mother died, I spoke freely, filling gaps the way people do when they are afraid of being forgotten. I shared details about work, about plans, about money, in the casual way families often do. I believed transparency meant trust. My mother had never agreed with that idea. She used to say that privacy was not a lack of love, but a form of self-respect. Read before you sign. Pause before you answer. Never explain your finances to people who feel entitled to them. At the time, I thought she was being overly careful. I did not yet understand how easily information could be repurposed. After she was gone, the questions started small. My father asked if I was managing all right on my own, if work had been steady, if I felt secure. They were framed as concern, and I answered them honestly. When my stepmother echoed those questions, adding comments about how unpredictable life could be, I nodded along. I did not see the pattern yet. Over time, the questions became more specific. How long did I plan to stay at my current job? Had I thought about buying instead of renting? Did I have safeguards in place in case something happened? My stepmother asked these things with a gentle smile, as if we were chatting about weather. My father listened closely, sometimes repeating my answers back to me days later. That repetition was the first thing that unsettled me. Answers were not just heard, they were stored. I remember one afternoon when I mentioned offhandedly that I had received a raise. It felt harmless, the kind of thing families celebrate. My stepmother congratulated me warmly. My father smiled, relieved. Weeks later, during a conversation about my half-sister's school expenses, that raise resurfaced as evidence that I could handle a little extra responsibility. I did not argue. I paid attention. The shift inside me happened quietly. I began to notice how often questions led somewhere else. How concern turned into suggestion. How suggestion turned into expectation. I started giving answers that were true but incomplete. Work was fine. Things were stable. I was managing. I did not elaborate. At first, I felt guilty. My father was still my father. Withholding information felt like withholding affection. But each time I considered explaining myself, I felt the same tightening in my chest, the same sense that words once released could not be reclaimed. There was a moment not long after my half-sister turned 18 when I nearly said too much. We were sitting at the table after dinner, the conversation drifting toward the future. My stepmother mentioned planning and contingencies. My father asked casually what I would do if I ever needed help. I opened my mouth to reassure him. Then I stopped. It was not fear that halted me. It was instinct, a quiet internal pause that said, "Wait." I changed the subject instead, asking about my half-sister's plans. The conversation moved on easily, almost too easily. No one pushed, no one insisted. But I noticed the way my stepmother watched me attentive in a way that felt newly focused. That was the moment silence became intentional. I did not announce it. I did not set rules out loud. I simply stopped volunteering information. I answered what was asked, but I no longer filled the space around the question. I let pauses linger. I let discomfort exist without rushing to smooth it over. The cost of that restraint showed up quickly. Conversations felt cooler. Invitations became less frequent. When I visited, my stepmother handled most of the talking, updating me on plans I had not been included in. My father seemed relieved by the structure she provided even when it edged me out. I worried I appeared distant. I worried I was becoming the kind of person people whispered about. But I also felt something else growing beneath the worry. A steadiness. A sense that I was no longer being led by guilt. As months passed, the tone shifted again. My father's concern sharpened. He asked if I was stressed, if I was sleeping well. My stepmother suggested that independence could be exhausting, that carrying everything alone took a toll. The words were sympathetic, but the implication was clear. They were beginning to question my capacity, not my well-being. My half-sister started using phrases that did not belong to her age. She talked about fairness, about family responsibility, about how everyone had to do their part. When she said these things, she glanced at my stepmother as if checking for approval. That was when I understood I was no longer part of a conversation. I was the subject of one. Silence in that context became protection. Not dramatic, not defiant, just measured. I shared less and listened more. I watched how urgency crept into their voices, how patience thinned when I did not offer solutions. I noticed how often my father deferred to my stepmother before responding. There were moments I wanted to confront them, to ask outright what they were trying to accomplish. But confrontation requires trust, and trust had already been eroded by the way information was being handled around me. The final realization came one evening during a phone call that was meant to be casual. My father asked if I would be willing to help more if the family needed it. Not if, but when. He spoke as though the decision had already been made, as though my role was simply to agree. I said I would think about it. When the call ended, I sat in silence for a long time, letting the quiet settle. For the first time, I saw the situation clearly. They were no longer asking whether I could help. They were calculating how much they could ask for and how quickly. Someone somewhere was running out of time, and the silence I had learned to keep was about to be tested in ways I had not yet imagined. Concern did not arrive loudly. It crept in, wearing the same voice my father had used my entire life, only slower now, more careful, as if each word had been weighed before it was spoken. He started calling more often. Not to talk exactly, but to check in. He asked how I was sleeping, if work had been stressful, if I ever felt overwhelmed living on my own. The questions were framed gently, but they followed a pattern I could no longer ignore. "I just worry about you," he said, once his tone heavy with implication. "You carry a lot on your shoulders." I told him I was fine. I said work was busy but manageable. I did not offer details. The pause that followed felt deliberate, as if he were waiting for me to fill the space. When I didn't, he moved on, sounding slightly disappointed. My stepmother joined these conversations soon after. Where my father's concern felt hesitant, hers was confident. She spoke as though she already understood my situation better than I did. "We've been talking about how hard it is for someone to do everything alone," she said one evening, emphasizing the we, especially these days. "People don't realize how much stress affects judgment." I recognized the language immediately. It wasn't curiosity, it was positioning. She never asked if I wanted advice. She offered conclusions. Independence, she implied, was admirable but risky. Autonomy was framed as isolation. The message was subtle but persistent. If something went wrong, it would be because I insisted on handling things myself. My half-sister began echoing the same sentiments. She asked if I ever thought about the future, about security. She spoke about family responsibility as if it were a shared script. The words sounded rehearsed coming out of her mouth, and she often glanced toward my stepmother after speaking, waiting for approval. I answered them all the same way. Calmly. Vaguely. I said I had plans. I said I was taking care of things. I did not argue or defend myself. I could feel the pressure rising each time my answers failed to satisfy them. The questions grew more pointed. My father asked if I had safeguards in place, if I'd ever spoken to a financial advisor, if I'd considered how quickly circumstances could change. He said these things with a softness that suggested he was doing me a favor by raising them. "What would happen if you got sick?" he asked one afternoon. Or if something unexpected came up, I told him I had it handled. He nodded, but his silence carried doubt. That was when I understood the shift. They were no longer checking on me. They were assessing me. My stepmother's role became more pronounced. She began speaking in summaries, recapping conversations as if decisions had already been made. "We just want to make sure everything is streamlined," she said. "No unnecessary complications." I noticed how often she used words like best and safe without explaining who decided what qualified as either. When I pushed back gently, asking what she meant, she smiled and said not to worry, that everything would make sense soon. My father deferred to her more openly then. When I asked him directly what he thought he said, he trusted her judgment. He said she was good at seeing the big picture. I wondered when my perspective had stopped being part of that picture. The emotional manipulation was subtle but relentless. My mother's name came up more frequently, invoked as a moral compass. "She always cared about stability," my father said once. "She wouldn't want you under unnecessary strain." The irony was almost unbearable. My mother had valued preparation, not surrender. She had taught me to read carefully, to question urgency. I doubted she would have approved of concern being used as leverage. I felt the familiar urge to explain myself rising in my chest, to clarify my choices, to prove I was capable. But I recognized that impulse for what it was: a trap. Any explanation I offered would become material. Any reassurance would be reframed as admission. So I restrained myself. I let the discomfort stand. I answered only what was asked and nothing more. That restraint did not go unnoticed. My stepmother's patience thinned. Her reassurances began to include timelines. "We'll need to think about this sooner rather than later," she said. "It's better to be proactive." My father echoed her, though less confidently. "It's just planning," he insisted. "No one's trying to rush you." But the contradiction was obvious. The more they insisted there was no urgency, the more urgent they became. The moment that crystallized everything happened during a conversation I thought would be harmless. We were discussing a family gathering when my stepmother casually mentioned looping in professionals. She said it as if it were an afterthought, as if experts were simply a natural extension of concern. Professionals, I asked, keeping my tone neutral. She smiled. Advisors. People who specialize in situations like yours. Situations like mine. The phrase settled heavily between us. My father nodded, adding that it might help take the pressure off me, that having guidance could prevent mistakes. He spoke as though the idea had been discussed extensively already, though no one had mentioned it to me before. I realized then that the conversation had crossed an invisible line. This was no longer about emotional support. It was about authority, about control disguised as care. I said I would think about it. When the call ended, I sat in silence, letting the realization sink in. Concern had become a tool. Questions had become probes. And whatever they were preparing next would not come in the form of a request. It would arrive fully formed, wrapped in politeness, carrying the assumption that my consent was inevitable. For the first time, I understood that silence alone might not be enough to protect me, and that when the paperwork appeared, the stakes would be far higher than hurt feelings or strained conversations. They were no longer testing my willingness to help. They were testing how much control I would allow them to take. My stepmother's warmth changed so gradually that I almost missed it. Almost. She started calling me by a nickname she had never used before. She asked about my work in a way that sounded personal, even caring. She sent texts just to check in, adding small heart emojis at the end, as if we had crossed into a new, closer phase of our relationship. If I hadn't already learned to pay attention to timing, I might have believed it was genuine. Instead, it felt rehearsed. She positioned herself as an ally, someone standing between my father's worry and my supposed independence. He means well, she told me once, lowering her voice as if sharing a secret. He just gets anxious. I try to smooth things over. The implication was clear. If there was tension, it wasn't coming from her. It was coming from him. And if there was resistance, it was coming from me. Her language was always reasonable. Peace, balance, what's best for everyone. She never accused. She suggested. She never demanded. She assumed. I began to notice how often she spoke about the household as a system. Finances were something to be managed. Decisions were something to be streamlined. Complications were inefficiencies to be eliminated. She spoke as if she were the administrator of something larger than herself, and in that framework, emotions were obstacles, not signals. My half-sister mirrored her more each week. She spoke with a confidence that did not belong to her age or experience. She talked about the future as if it were already mapped out, as if outcomes were guarantees rather than possibilities. When she mentioned fairness, it always seemed to benefit her. When she talked about sacrifice, it was always someone else's. One afternoon, we all met for dinner. Nothing formal. Just a family meal, the kind that used to feel comfortable. My stepmother took charge, immediately assigning seats, directing conversations, steering topics away from anything uncertain. She asked me questions in front of everyone, not waiting for my answers before continuing. "You're so capable," she said, smiling brightly. "You've always been independent. Not everyone has that advantage." Advantage. The word stuck with me. Independence was no longer a choice I had made. It was a resource to be redistributed. My father sat quietly, nodding along. He looked relieved to let her lead, to let someone else define what was reasonable. When I looked at him, he avoided my eyes. His silence felt heavier than her words. As the evening went on, the comparisons became more obvious. My half-sister's needs were discussed openly. Her plans, her expenses, her future. My life was referenced only in relation to what it allowed me to give up. I was expected to understand, to empathize, to accommodate. When I gently pushed back, saying I had responsibilities of my own, my stepmother tilted her head sympathetically. "Of course," she said. But family is about flexibility, about showing up when it matters. I wondered when it had been decided that this mattered more than anything else. There was a moment brief but telling when she slipped. She spoke about when everything is finalized, then quickly corrected herself. The word hung in the air, heavy with implication. Finalized what no one explained. No one needed to. The certainty in her voice said enough. That was when I understood that this wasn't a discussion. It was preparation. The friendliness that followed felt conditional, like a reward offered in advance. My stepmother laughed more easily. She complimented me on small things. She spoke about how nice it was to feel united. It was warmth with an expiration date. I began to see the structure underneath it all. My stepmother as strategist, my father as enabler, my half-sister as beneficiary, and me positioned carefully as the solution to a problem I had not created. The hardest part was not the manipulation itself. It was recognizing how easily my father accepted it. He did not challenge the narrative being built around me. He did not ask what I wanted. He seemed grateful that someone else was handling the tension he did not know how to confront. That realization hurt more than I expected. I stopped hoping the situation would correct itself. I stopped waiting for fairness to emerge organically. Instead, I watched. I listened. I noticed how often decisions were framed as already settled, how often urgency was implied without explanation. My stepmother's smile remained pleasant, but it no longer fooled me. It had conditions. It existed only as long as I stayed cooperative. As long as I did not ask questions, she did not want to answer. By the end of the night, I felt a strange clarity settle over me. Whatever was coming next would not be spontaneous. It would arrive organized, justified, and presented as a favor. As I left the house, my stepmother hugged me a little too tightly. "We'll talk soon," she said softly, "about everything." I nodded, already understanding what she meant. She was no longer testing my boundaries. She was preparing to cross them. The first time legal language entered the conversation, it was disguised as relief. My father said it would take some pressure off me. My stepmother said it would make things simpler. Neither of them said the word lawyer out loud at first. They used softer terms instead. Advisor, planner, someone who understands these things. It came up during a phone call that was meant to be casual. My father asked how my week had been, listened just long enough to sound attentive, then cleared his throat. "We've been thinking," he said, drawing out the phrase as if it carried weight, "about how complicated life gets if things aren't organized." I said nothing. My stepmother picked up the thread immediately. "There are people who specialize in situations like yours," she said brightly. "People who make sure everything is protected. You wouldn't have to worry so much. Situations like mine." The phrase made my stomach tighten. I asked what she meant by protected. She smiled even though she couldn't see me. From stress, from mistakes, from having to handle everything alone. My father added that there was no rush. He said it twice, which told me the opposite was true. "We just want you to have options," he said. "It's about being responsible." Responsibility had become their favorite word. It was flexible, moral-sounding, and impossible to argue against without sounding selfish. In the weeks that followed, the language became more precise. My father mentioned planning for contingencies. My stepmother talked about capacity and long-term safety. She said independence was admirable but also exhausting. "People don't realize how much pressure that puts on you," she said, "especially when you don't have a safety net." I did not correct her. What struck me most was how rehearsed it all felt. The same phrases appeared in different conversations spoken by different people. When my father hesitated, my stepmother stepped in seamlessly. When I asked a question, she redirected before he could answer. They were not improvising. They were following a script. My half-sister joined in more openly then. She asked if I had ever thought about what would happen if I burned out. She talked about how nice it would be if everyone worked together. She sounded proud of herself, as if she were participating in something grown and important. I realized they were discussing me when I wasn't there. Instead of reacting, I started paying closer attention. I noticed who spoke first. I noticed how my father deferred, how often he looked to my stepmother before responding. I noticed the urgency underneath the calm, the way timelines were hinted at without being stated. There was a moment when I almost agreed to something I didn't fully understand. My stepmother suggested a consultation. Just a conversation, she said. No commitments, no paperwork. It couldn't hurt to listen, she added. I felt the familiar pull to reassure them, to prove I was cooperative. I nearly said yes. Then I remembered my mother's voice, steady and unyielding. Never agree to review something you don't control. Never step into a process you don't understand the exit from. I told them I'd think about it. The reaction was immediate. My stepmother's tone sharpened just slightly. My father asked what there was to think about. He said it was all standard. He said everyone did it. The contradiction between their calm words and rising impatience was unmistakable. That was when I saw the fear beneath it. My father looked tired in a way he hadn't before. Distracted. His reassurance felt forced, like someone trying to convince himself as much as me. He avoided specifics, brushed past questions, and circled back to urgency without naming it. Something external was driving this. Something with a deadline. A few days later, my stepmother mentioned that some documents were already being prepared. Just drafts, she said lightly. Nothing official. It's easier to have things ready. The idea that paperwork existed without my consent sent a chill through me. Drafts meant assumptions. Assumptions meant decisions had already been made. I asked what kind of documents. She waved the question away. Nothing you need to worry about yet. Yet. I understood then that the next step would not be another conversation. It would be paper placed in front of me, language dense enough to intimidate, urgency polished into politeness. They would expect me to feel grateful. They would expect me to comply. That night I barely slept. I walked through my apartment, touching familiar objects, grounding myself in the reality I had built. I thought about how easily concern could be weaponized, how quickly authority could be claimed by those who spoke confidently enough. By morning, my resolve had hardened. If paperwork was coming, I would not be caught unprepared. Silence alone would no longer be enough. I would need to be deliberate, informed, ready to act when the moment came. Because whatever they were planning, it wasn't about helping me feel safe. It was about making sure I didn't have a choice. The realization did not come all at once. It arrived quietly, settling into place after weeks of conversations that never quite said what they meant. I was not being asked to help. I was being positioned. Once I saw that everything that had felt confusing suddenly made sense, the careful concern, the rehearsed phrases, the way every solution seemed to require my compliance but never my consent. I replayed the past months in my head, and the pattern became impossible to ignore. Every discussion ended the same way, with an expectation that I would adjust, accommodate, step aside. I was the variable they needed to control. My father's behavior changed in small but telling ways. He was shorter with me, more distracted. When I asked direct questions, he deflected or answered vaguely. He spoke about the future as if it were already narrowed down to a single path, one that did not include my input. I could see the strain on his face now, the tension he could no longer hide. For the first time, I wondered what he was afraid of. He was not a cruel man. He was a man who hated uncertainty and would accept almost any solution that promised relief. My stepmother understood that. She stepped into that weakness with precision, offering structure, where he felt lost confidence, where he felt overwhelmed. And in doing so, she took the lead. She no longer framed her suggestions as ideas. She spoke in conclusions. "This is what makes sense," she said. "This is the safest option." When I hesitated, she looked at me as if I were being unreasonable, as if I were resisting help out of pride rather than instinct. My half-sister's role became clearer too. She stopped asking questions and started making statements. She talked about outcomes as if they were guaranteed. She referenced plans she had no business knowing about. The ease with which she spoke told me she had been reassured, promised something. Security, perhaps, or inheritance. Or simply the comfort of knowing she would never be the one asked to sacrifice. That was when it hit me fully. They did not see me as family in this equation. They saw me as a risk factor. My independence was not admirable to them. It was inconvenient. It made me harder to influence, harder to frame as dependent or incapable. If they wanted control, they needed to undermine that independence first. I felt a surge of anger, then sharp and immediate. Not because of money or planning or paperwork, but because of the quiet erasure it represented. I was no longer a daughter whose perspective mattered. I was a problem to be solved. For a moment, I considered confronting them, asking outright what they were trying to do, demanding honesty, but the thought passed quickly. Confrontation assumes good faith, and good faith had already been exhausted. Instead, I adjusted. I stopped answering calls immediately. I returned messages hours later, then days. When we spoke, I kept my tone neutral, my responses brief. I asked questions that encouraged them to talk more, revealing inconsistencies without realizing it. I let them believe I was hesitant rather than resistant. Inside, I was preparing. There was one moment that sealed everything for me. We were sitting together in the living room, my stepmother flipping through her phone, my father staring at the floor. My half-sister mentioned something about how much easier things would be once everything was settled. She said it casually, like an aside. Settled. I asked what she meant. She froze just for a second, then laughed it off, saying she meant in general. My stepmother shot her a look that was too quick to be accidental. My father cleared his throat and changed the subject. That was it. The confirmation I needed. They had already discussed an outcome. They were simply managing the steps required to get there. The sadness hit me later when I was alone. I grieved the father I thought I had, the one who used to ask my opinion and listen to the answer. I grieved the idea that loyalty would protect me. I let myself feel that loss fully, because pretending otherwise would only weaken me. Once the grief passed, clarity took its place. I could not appeal to emotion. I could not rely on history. I could not trust that fairness would assert itself naturally. If I wanted to protect myself, I would have to do it deliberately. I began reviewing everything my mother had ever taught me, every quiet lesson I had dismissed as caution. She had seen this possibility. Maybe not these exact faces, but the pattern. She had prepared me not to fight loudly, but to stand firm when it mattered. I anticipated what would come next. Documents, deadlines, gentle pressure framed as necessity. They would try to move quickly before I had time to involve anyone else, before I could think too clearly. They underestimated me in one crucial way. They believed my silence meant uncertainty. In reality, it meant restraint. By the end of that week, I no longer felt confused or afraid. I felt resolved. The path ahead would be uncomfortable, and the outcome would permanently change my relationship with my family. But the alternative was worse. The alternative was disappearance. I was not being asked to save the family. I was being asked to step out of the way so they could move forward without resistance. And that was something I would never agree to, no matter how softly they asked. They came over on a Saturday afternoon, without warning, carrying smiles that felt practiced and a folder that immediately changed the air in the room. My stepmother set it on the coffee table as if it were nothing more than a magazine she wanted to show me. Thick, organized, tabs visible along the edge. The kind of folder that announces intention without saying a word. My father lingered near the doorway, hands clasped, avoiding my eyes. My half-sister sat down quickly, already comfortable, as if she knew how this was supposed to end. We thought it would be easier to talk in person, my stepmother said, her voice light. This way there's no confusion. No confusion for whom I wondered. She opened the folder and slid a few pages forward, careful not to call them what they were. Not contracts, not agreements. Just information, she said. Just something to look over. My father nodded along, repeating that no one was rushing me, that this was about making sure everything was handled properly. Handled by whom was the unspoken question. The language on the pages was dense, deliberately so. Phrases like temporary authority and standard safeguards jumped out immediately. I recognized the structure even before I understood the specifics. This wasn't about advice. It was about control. About positioning decisions somewhere else under the guise of protection. My stepmother spoke steadily, explaining each section as if she were reading from a script. She emphasized convenience, efficiency, peace of mind. She avoided words like transfer and limitation, replacing them with softer alternatives: oversight, support, continuity. My father added comments when prompted, always circling back to concern. "We just want you to be safe," he said. "This takes the pressure off. Pressure I hadn't complained about." My half-sister leaned forward, scanning the pages with interest she didn't bother to hide. "This makes sense," she said, glancing up at me. "It's smart. Everyone does this." I noticed how quickly she aligned herself with the outcome, how little curiosity she had about what it meant for me. I took my time reading. I asked clarifying questions, not because I expected honest answers, but because I needed to hear how they responded. My stepmother answered smoothly, confidently. My father deferred. When I asked what would happen if circumstances changed, she smiled and said we could revisit things later. Later was doing a lot of work in that sentence. The trap revealed itself slowly. Authority framed as temporary, but structured in a way that would be difficult to reverse. Decisions made in my best interest, defined by people who stood to benefit from them. My independence recast as vulnerability. My caution reframed as stress. I felt a flicker of panic rise in my chest, sharp and unexpected. This was closer than I had imagined. If I signed anything, even acknowledging receipt, the narrative would shift. I would no longer be the one choosing. I would be the one being managed. My stepmother slid a pen across the table, casual, almost playful. "There's no obligation today," she said. "We just thought it would be helpful to get the process started." Started. I picked up the pen, feeling its weight between my fingers. For a moment, the room felt smaller. The faces around me expectant. My father hopeful. My stepmother certain. My half-sister impatient. I thought of my mother then not as a memory, but as a presence. Her insistence on reading carefully, on questioning urgency, on never mistaking pressure for love. I set the pen down. "I need more time," I said calmly. "I want to review this properly." The reaction was immediate. My stepmother's smile tightened. My father frowned, confusion flickering across his face. "There's nothing complicated here," he said. "It's standard. Standard for who I asked." My stepmother stepped in quickly. "We're just trying to help. There's no reason to make this harder than it needs to be." Harder for whom again went unspoken. She mentioned a timeline, then slipping it into the conversation as if it had always been there. Certain steps needed to be taken soon. Delays could cause issues. It would be better to act now while everything was still manageable. The urgency contradicted everything they had said before. The shift was subtle, but unmistakable. This was no longer a suggestion. It was a push. I felt anger rise hot and clear, but I kept my voice steady. "I won't sign anything today," I said. "If this is about my well-being, then taking time shouldn't be a problem." My father looked between us, visibly uncomfortable. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. My stepmother exhaled sharply, then recovered, nodding as if she had expected this resistance all along. "Of course," she said. "We just didn't want you to feel alone in this." The irony was almost painful. They gathered the papers, stacking them neatly back into the folder. The pen disappeared. The atmosphere shifted again. Politeness snapping back into place. My half-sister rolled her eyes when she thought I wasn't looking. When they left, the silence was deafening. I sat alone on the couch, staring at the empty space on the table where the folder had been. My hands were shaking not from fear, but from the realization of how close I had come. This had not been a conversation. It had been an ambush. I replayed every word, every glance, every contradiction, the assumptions baked into the documents, the certainty in my stepmother's voice, the way my father had stepped back rather than forward, the ease with which my half-sister accepted an outcome that diminished me. They had expected compliance. They had prepared for hesitation, but not refusal, and they would not stop here. As evening settled in, I understood something with startling clarity. Silence alone would not protect me anymore. The next move would be theirs, and it would come faster than I was ready for if I didn't act. This was no longer about preserving relationships or avoiding conflict. It was about autonomy, about the right to decide my own future. And if they believed I would fold under pressure, they were about to learn how badly they had misjudged me. After they left, I sat very still, letting the quiet settle around me, replaying the afternoon with a clarity that bordered on disbelief. I had been closer to losing control than I wanted to admit. Not because I was weak, but because the trap had been carefully built to look reasonable. Concern had been polished into authority. Help had been wrapped around limitation. And for a moment I had felt the pull of wanting it all to stop, of wanting someone else to take responsibility so I could breathe again. That realization scared me more than the papers themselves. I stood up and paced my living room, retracing each step of the conversation, each word that had been chosen to guide me toward a conclusion I hadn't agreed to. The documents were designed to look temporary, but I knew better. Temporary arrangements have a way of becoming permanent once momentum takes over. I understood then how easily a life could be redirected with a single signature. That night, sleep didn't come easily. I lay awake thinking about my mother, not in the soft, nostalgic way I usually did, but with a new sense of urgency. I saw her clearly again, not as someone fragile or sentimental, but as the woman who had quietly prepared for the realities others preferred to ignore. She had never trusted hope without structure. She believed in foresight, in planning for people to disappoint you without letting that possibility harden your heart. When she talked about protection, she didn't mean walls. She meant leverage. I got up before dawn and went to the small fireproof box in my closet. I hadn't opened it in years, not because I'd forgotten about it, but because I hadn't needed to. Inside were documents my mother had insisted I keep separate. She'd told me once that some things should never be stored where emotions live. I spread the contents across my kitchen table, my hands steady now. The trust documents were exactly where I remembered them, precise and unapologetically thorough. Reading them again, I felt a strange mix of grief and gratitude. She had anticipated more than illness. She had anticipated pressure. The trust wasn't just about money. It was about control. About keeping decision-making authority out of reach from anyone who might see my vulnerability as an opportunity. It limited access, restricted interference, and required independent oversight. It assumed conflict without naming names. I realized something important as I read. The people who had brought me those papers had no idea how protected I actually was. They were operating under an assumption that silence meant ignorance, that my restraint meant I didn't understand what was happening. They were wrong. I sat there for a long time absorbing the implications. The trust was strong, but it wasn't invincible. If they succeeded in reframing me as overwhelmed or incapable, they could still try to challenge it. That had been the purpose of the concern. The questions. The suggestions about stress and capacity. Once I saw the strategy laid out clearly, the fear loosened its grip. This wasn't personal in the way betrayal usually is. It was procedural. My father hadn't woken up one morning wanting to hurt me. He had been pushed into urgency by someone who understood leverage better than loyalty. My stepmother had simply identified the obstacle and designed a path around it. And my half-sister had been promised a future that didn't include me standing in the way. Understanding that didn't make it easier emotionally, but it made it simpler strategically. By mid-morning, I had made a decision. Silence was no longer enough. Observation had served its purpose. The next phase required action, but not confrontation. Not yet. I needed someone outside the family system, someone who spoke the language of documents and authority without emotional entanglement, someone who wouldn't mistake politeness for harmlessness. I made the call carefully, choosing discretion over familiarity. I didn't explain everything at once. I didn't dramatize. I laid out facts, timelines, behaviors. The appearance of documents without consent. The pressure framed as concern. On the other end of the line, there was a pause, then a measured response. Questions that mattered. Questions my family had never asked. That was when I felt the ground shift beneath me. For the first time since this began, I wasn't alone in the process. I wasn't reacting. I was preparing. As the day went on, my phone buzzed repeatedly. Missed calls. Messages framed as checking in. My stepmother asked if I'd had time to think. My father said he hoped I wasn't feeling stressed. The urgency had sharpened. I didn't respond. Instead, I took notes. I wrote down what was said when it was said and how it was framed. I documented the pressure without acknowledging it. I understood now that every interaction was part of a record, whether they realized it or not. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table again, but this time I felt steady. The panic had been replaced by something quieter and stronger. Resolve. My mother had trusted me to recognize the moment when kindness needed reinforcement. She had trusted me to act without explanation when explanation would only weaken my position. The truth was simple, even if the situation wasn't. They believed time was on their side. They believed I would eventually fold, apologize for resisting, and comply for the sake of peace. They didn't know that the trust they underestimated was about to become the very thing that stopped them. And they certainly didn't know that their next move would walk them directly into a confrontation they were not prepared to handle. I turned off my phone, closed the fireproof box, and let myself breathe for the first time in days. Whatever came next, I would meet it informed, protected, and ready. They thought my silence meant uncertainty. In reality, it meant I was done being cornered. I agreed to meet them again, and the relief in my father's voice was immediate. He said he was glad I'd come around. My stepmother said she knew I would see reason once I had time to think. They chose the location this time, my father's house framed as neutral ground. Familiar, comfortable, safe. I let them believe that the pressure had worked. When I arrived, everything was prepared. The table cleared, the same folder waiting thicker than before. Fresh copies. My half-sister was already there, seated close to my stepmother, confidence radiating from her posture. My father hovered, trying to look calm. I sat down and listened. My stepmother led the conversation as expected, summarizing where we had left off, emphasizing how much easier things would be once everything was finalized. She spoke about timelines again, about how delaying decisions could create unnecessary complications. She never once asked what I wanted. I nodded. I asked a few practical questions. I let them explain. The longer they talked, the more comfortable they became. My father chimed in, repeating phrases he'd clearly been coached to say. My half-sister smiled already, picturing an outcome she thought was guaranteed. Then, when my stepmother slid the papers toward me and reached for the pen, I stopped her with a raised hand. Before we go any further, I said calmly, I want to make sure everyone is clear on something. The room went quiet. I've had these documents reviewed, I continued, by someone independent, someone who specializes in estate protection. My father's face drained of color. My stepmother froze, her hand still hovering over the table. My half-sister's smile faltered. You did what my father asked. I sought advice, I said, the kind you encouraged me to get. My stepmother recovered quickly, forcing a smile. That's fine, she said. We expected that. It doesn't change anything. It does, I replied. Quite a bit. I reached into my bag and placed a single document on the table. Not thick, not intimidating, just enough. The effect was immediate. My stepmother leaned forward, scanning it. My father stared at it without touching it. "This outlines my legal position," I said evenly. "It also explains why the approach you're taking won't work." My stepmother laughed lightly, too lightly. "I think you might be misunderstanding." "I'm not," I said. "And before you respond, you should know that everything discussed today is being documented." The word documented changed the air completely. My father shifted in his seat. "Why are you making this adversarial?" he asked. "We're just trying to help." "Helping doesn't require removing my authority," I said. "Helping doesn't assume incapacity, and it doesn't involve preparing documents without consent." My stepmother's smile disappeared. "We were protecting you, from what I asked." She hesitated. Just long enough. From the corner of my eye, I saw my half-sister tense. "This is ridiculous," she said. "You're overreacting." "No," I said quietly. "I'm reacting appropriately." I explained then clearly and without emotion what the documents actually did. How authority would shift, how temporary measures could become permanent, how my independence would be reframed as risk. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I described. My father listened, visibly shaken. "We didn't know it would go that far," he said. "That's the problem," I replied. "You didn't want to know." My stepmother interrupted sharper now. "So what are you saying? That we can't help you at all?" "I'm saying I don't need this kind of help," I said, "and I won't accept it." She leaned back, folding her arms. "Then what was the point of this meeting?" I met her gaze steadily. "To make it clear that this stops now." Silence filled the room. My half-sister looked between us, panic replacing confidence. My father rubbed his temples, suddenly looking older than I'd ever seen him. "There's also something else," I added. "The trust my mother left me includes safeguards specifically designed to prevent exactly this situation." That was the moment everything tipped. My stepmother's eyes widened. What trust? I didn't answer immediately. I let the question hang. "The one you didn't know about," I said. "Because I didn't tell you. On purpose." My father looked at me as if seeing me for the first time. "Your mother never mentioned she didn't need to," I said. "She planned for me." I explained only what was necessary. That the trust limited interference. That attempts to override it would trigger reviews no one in this room would want. That urgency would work against them, not for them. My stepmother opened her mouth, then closed it again. For the first time, she had no script. "So that's it?" my father asked quietly. "Yes," I said. "This ends here." My half-sister stood abruptly. "You can't just do this." "I can," I said, "and I am." The folder was pushed back toward my stepmother untouched. The pen remained on the table, useless. When I stood to leave, my father spoke again. "We were just trying to keep the family together." I paused at the door. "You were trying to keep control," I said. "There's a difference." I walked out without waiting for a response. The air outside felt lighter, as if something tight around my chest had finally loosened. I sat in my car for a moment before starting the engine. Hands, steady, heart calm. The tables hadn't turned with shouting or threats. They turned because I had refused to disappear quietly. And in that moment, I knew that no matter what followed, I had already won the one thing that mattered most. The silence that followed was heavier than any argument we had avoided. In the days after that meeting, no one called to apologize. No one reached out to clarify or smooth things over. Instead, there was a noticeable shift, as if a switch had been flipped, and the system they had built around me no longer knew how to operate. My father tried first, but not in the way I had once hoped. He left a voicemail that sounded rehearsed, full of words like misunderstanding and intentions. He said no one meant to pressure me. He said things had gotten out of hand. What he didn't say was, "I'm sorry." What he didn't ask was how I felt. When we spoke again, his voice lacked its earlier urgency. Without leverage, he sounded unsure of himself. He asked if we could just move on, if we could forget the whole thing and go back to normal. There was no normal to return to. My stepmother didn't bother pretending. Her messages were brief and cool, stripped of warmth. She spoke about disappointment, about how hurtful it was to be mistrusted. She framed herself as the one wronged, as if boundaries were an attack rather than a response. The mask had slipped, and it didn't bother her anymore. My half-sister reacted the way I expected. Anger first, then disbelief. She accused me of overreacting, of making things complicated for no reason. She said I was selfish, that I didn't care about the family. The certainty she once carried was gone, replaced by frustration that things hadn't gone according to plan. What struck me most was how quickly their concern disappeared once control was no longer possible. There were no more questions about my stress levels, no more comments about my safety, no offers of help. The language of care vanished overnight, revealing how conditional it had always been. On the practical side, things unraveled quietly. The professionals my stepmother had referenced stopped reaching out. The follow-ups never came. The documents were never mentioned again. The momentum they had tried so hard to create collapsed the moment resistance became permanent. I realized then that the confrontation hadn't ended anything. It had exposed it. Without the illusion of cooperation, there was nothing left to negotiate. They weren't interested in compromise. They had wanted compliance. Once that was off the table, so was the relationship as they had imagined it. That truth hurt more than I expected. I grieved the family I thought I had, not the one that existed in practice. I grieved the version of my father who would have protected me instead of stepping aside. I grieved the idea that loyalty alone could keep you safe. But grief, unlike fear, is something you can move through. I stopped explaining myself. I stopped defending decisions that were no longer up for discussion. When messages came that tried to reopen the conversation, I answered politely but firmly, repeating the same boundary without embellishment. No, I'm not reconsidering. No, I don't need assistance. No, this isn't up for debate. Each time I said it, the words felt easier. Distance replaced conflict. Not the dramatic kind, but the quiet kind that settles in when there's nothing left to argue about. Visits stopped. Calls became rare. The space they left behind felt strange at first, then peaceful. I returned to my routines without the constant vigilance I hadn't realized I'd been carrying. Mornings felt lighter. Decisions felt cleaner. I noticed how much energy had been consumed by anticipating pressure that no longer existed. That absence was its own form of justice. There was one final attempt, subtle and almost clever. A message framed as concern for my future, suggesting we revisit things once emotions had cooled. I read it once, then twice, and recognized it for what it was. A door left slightly open just in case I wanted to step back into the old dynamic. I closed it without responding. What surprised me most was not their reaction, but mine. I didn't feel guilty. I didn't feel cruel. I felt resolved. For the first time, I understood that boundaries don't need agreement to be real. They only need consistency. Family, I learned, is not defined by who demands access to your life, but by who respects your right to live it. Care that requires surrender isn't care at all. It's control with better marketing. In the quiet that followed, I found myself returning to ordinary moments with a deeper appreciation. Making coffee in the morning. Choosing how to spend my weekends. Saying no without rehearsing explanations in my head. These small freedoms were the things I had nearly lost. Looking back, I realized something else. Silence hadn't cost me the relationship. The absence of respect had. And while that loss still carried weight, it was no longer mine to carry alone. I had done what I needed to do to protect myself, even if it meant letting go of people who only valued me when I was useful. The hardest part was accepting that some relationships don't break in a single moment. They erode, slowly revealed fully, only when you stop participating in the illusion. By the time I understood that the choice was no longer painful, it was necessary. Peace didn't arrive all at once. It came quietly in small moments I almost missed, because I wasn't bracing for anything anymore. Weeks passed without drama, and that alone felt unfamiliar. My phone stayed silent most days. No urgent check-ins. No carefully worded concern. No reminders about responsibility or family unity. At first, the absence felt strange, like the echo after a door closes. Then it began to feel like space. Real space. The kind you can breathe in. I settled into routines I hadn't realized I'd been interrupting for years. I woke up without dread. I made decisions without rehearsing explanations. I stopped anticipating questions that were never really questions at all. My life felt quieter but not emptier. Lighter. The boundaries I set didn't require announcements or speeches. They held because I held them. When messages came, I answered calmly or not at all. When guilt tried to surface, it didn't last. I reminded myself that self-protection is not cruelty, and silence chosen freely is not submission. I thought about my mother often during that time, not with sadness, but with a steady sense of connection. She had trusted me to recognize the moment when love needed reinforcement. She had known that preparation wasn't pessimism. It was care extended into the future. The trust she left me wasn't just a legal structure. It was a message. One I hadn't fully understood until I needed it most. It said you don't owe access to anyone who confuses control with concern. It said dignity doesn't expire just because someone asks nicely for you to give it up. When I thought back to the day my father asked me to save the family, the words sounded different now. What he was really asking was for me to carry a weight that wasn't mine, to sacrifice clarity for comfort, to step aside so others could move forward unchallenged. Saving the family would have meant losing myself. I didn't hate him for asking. I understood fear. I understood how easily urgency could distort judgment. But understanding didn't require compliance. Love didn't require surrender. I accepted that my relationship with my father would never be what it was before. And I stopped trying to rebuild something that depended on me being smaller than I am. Forgiveness. I learned is not the same as access. You can release anger without reopening the door. The most surprising change was internal. I stopped measuring my worth by how agreeable I was. I stopped interpreting discomfort as a sign I was doing something wrong. I learned that clarity often feels lonely before it feels freeing. And then it began to feel freeing. I started noticing how often women are asked to be flexible when flexibility only moves in one direction. How often concern is used to soften a demand. How frequently silence is mistaken for weakness when it's actually restraint. Choosing silence that day didn't make me passive. It made me deliberate. It gave me time to see the pattern, to understand the stakes, and to act without panic. Speaking too soon would have cost me everything. Waiting allowed me to keep it. If I had spoken when my father first called, if I had tried to explain or justify or reassure, I would have revealed exactly what they were trying to uncover. Instead, I listened. I observed. I protected myself without confrontation until confrontation was unavoidable. And when it came, I was ready. Today my life looks ordinary from the outside. I work. I rest. I make plans that belong to me. There are no dramatic victories or public apologies. Just consistency. Just peace. Just a future that isn't negotiated behind my back. If you're listening to this and something feels familiar, you're not alone. Many people are asked to do the right thing when the right thing conveniently benefits everyone but them. Many are pressured to confuse love with obligation, loyalty with compliance. If you've ever felt that tightening in your chest when someone frames control as care, trust that feeling. If you've ever been told that your boundaries are selfish, ask yourself who benefits from you not having them. Silence isn't always the answer. But sometimes, silence is the pause that saves you. I don't regret staying quiet. I don't regret choosing myself. And if I had to face that moment again, I'd make the same choice without hesitation. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever been asked to sacrifice your independence for the sake of family harmony? Where do you draw the line between support and control? Your experience might help someone else feel less alone. And if you want to hear more stories about boundaries, quiet strength, and the moments that change everything, stay with us. Subscribe, share your perspective, and be part of a community where dignity always comes first.